Brand new reporting reveals that the presumptive Republican nominee for president is plotting another cover-up of his role at the heart of one of the darkest episodes in recent American history, the deadly Capitol insurrection. Team Trump now trying to wash away what is an indelible stain on Trump's presidency as he asked the American people to send him back to the White House. The Guardian reporting this, quote, Donald Trump is expected to launch a new legal battle to suppress any damaging evidence from his 2020 election subversion case from becoming public before the 2024 election, preparing to shut down the potency of any mini trials where high-profile officials could testify against him. These so-called mini trials are the result of the Supreme Court ruling that Trump is immune from prosecution for official acts, even if those official acts were done in furtherance of a coup plot. They are evidentiary hearings that are intended to determine how much of special counsel Jack Smith's indictment of Donald Trump in the federal election case remains intact. As legal expert Norm Eisen put it, quote, it's going to put some of the most disturbing elements of the attempted coup on trial for the American people, for the court and the American people to consider. In theory, that could potentially include witnesses, Trump's own Vice President Mike Pence, or his former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, for example. No surprise, then, that Donald Trump would be desperate to prevent these hearings from ever happening. Also from The Guardian, quote, in the coming months, Trump's lawyers are expected to argue that the judge can decide whether the conduct is immune based on legal arguments alone, negating the need for witnesses or multiple evidentiary hearings. If prosecutors with the special counsel Jack Smith's office press for witnesses such as former Vice President Mike Pence or White House officials to testify, Donald Trump's lawyers are expected to launch a flurry of executive privilege and other measures to block their appearances. And as for the central issue at these hearings, what conduct is covered under the Supreme Court's definition of presidential immunity, Team Trump will reportedly argue, in effect, that a coup is okay as long as the president of the United States does it. Once again, from The Guardian, quote, Trump's lawyers are expected to argue the maximalist position that they considered all of the charged conduct was Donald Trump acting in his official capacity as president and therefore presumptively immune and incumbent on prosecutors to prove otherwise. This incredibly consequential legal battle is expected to start next month when Judge Tanya Chutkan regains control of the case. Let's bring in the journalist behind the scoop, senior political correspondent for The Guardian, Hugo Lowell, bylined on that reporting. John and Harry are back with us. Hugo, tell us more.
Yeah, look, I think Trump well knows that the evidence that could come out of these hearings could be politically really damaging, but also legally damaging, right? I mean, there is the political element because the stuff about January 6th and Trump's efforts to overturn the election don't play well with voters. We know that. We see that in the polls. But there's also a legal element here, which is if prosecutors can put up some of the best witnesses they have in front of Judge Chutkan and have them testify that, no, Trump was acting in his capacity as a candidate and not the president, well, it could make prosecutors' life easier in terms of overcoming that presumptive immunity. And so they have found a way, kind of they're planning still, but they have found a way to get through this in their eyes, and that is to launch this two-pronged attack. One, to say that we don't need hearings at all, and if we do need hearings, we can do it only on legal arguments. We will be dry, boring legal arguments, and it will be kind of hypotheticals that the lawyers raise in court. And if Jack Smith really presses for witnesses, then they know they have a bigger problem, and they are expecting to launch a flurry of executive privilege motions. They want to say to the judge that the record is anew and that the previous decisions before the grand jury investigation are not binding, and that she needs to litigate the privilege issues anew. And I think that's going to be the cornerstone of Trump's effort to make sure that none of the really damaging evidence gets before the public before November.
Harry Litman, will it work?
It might. The Supreme Court opinion is not only incredibly broad in its basic articulation of the immunity principle, Nicole, but it also contains these mines and sinkholes of other principles. Here's a very big one. You may not have evidence of immune conduct to prove even your unofficial and non-immune case. So I know there are a lot of people, close colleagues of ours, are enamored of this mini trial idea, but there's a circularity in the court opinion. Jack Smith says, I call Mike Pence to the stand because I want to establish that this was, in fact, non-immune. And Trump says, wait a second, that you are not allowed to give any evidence of immune conduct. Stop the music. You must decide it first. What does Chutkan do now? And remember, this is immunity, meaning there is always interlocutory appeal. So I think at a minimum, there is grist for Trump to try to block it and then take appeals from it and to keep what exactly Hugo's talking about, which is evidence. Yes, they can do it on the allegations, and that's part of what the court talked about in the case. But can they actually bring Pence to the stand or Pat Cipollone or anyone of that nature when the court has said you can't present evidence of immune conduct to prove this case? I think there's a whole kind of obstacle course that the court has set up even before you get to that point, and it is damn tricky.
You know, John Hallman, Michael Cohen said something in the first block. He said, you know, vote for Democrats up and down the ballot if you don't like this. I mean, this Supreme Court has given the pro-democracy, pro-rule of law coalition such grist, right? Because I don't really understand all of the legal things being batted around and weaponized by Trump. But it is clear that Donald Trump on live TV had his supporters go to the Capitol, beat cops with sticks, endangered the life of Mike Pence, and he's going to get away with it. And I feel like for 8 years, we've covered efforts by the federal criminal justice system, Mueller and SDNY and Jack Smith and Tanya Chutkan and Aileen Cannon to hold him accountable. And it's a giant goose egg, not a nothing zero. No one's coming to save anyone from Donald Trump's criming except the voters. What does this, in your view, look like if successfully argued as a political issue?
Well, I first want to say, Nicole, you and I are we both have exactly the same amount of legal training, which is to say none. But I think that we both have wandered around politics and the intersection of politics and law long enough to adduce one important way of thinking about this, which is that the Supreme Court's really screwed us, you know, and I think that's the bottom line here. It's amazing that how one decision with it written the way that Harry just described, with the landmines that it's kind of strewn around, the trapdoors, beyond just the headline of it, you know, the way in which it's kind of having this kind of metastatic kind of effect on all of these potential prosecutions and efforts at legal accountability is really incredibly dispiriting. And I think it's particularly dispiriting for those of us who saw in 2020 how, you know, after 4 years of banging at the guardrails of American democracy and plowing through a lot of those guardrails and showing us all how actually fragile the system of democratic rule and democratic accountability that is America actually was, we all looked up and said, well, man, you know, I'll tell you what, the courts held. Thank God the courts held, you know, because Trump, you know, waged all these lawsuits trying to prove that the election was stolen, and he got knocked down in every single one of them. Republican judges, Democratic judges, Republican states, Democratic states. You know, we said, well, look, that's one guardrail that's still there, the judiciary. And as much as anything, what happened at the Supreme Court with this immunity ruling, it feels to me like the last guardrail has now been knocked down. And that's not to say that there aren't still judges who will uphold the rule of law, but when the Supreme Court knocks down the guardrail, that has these ripple effects across all of the rest of the judiciary, where judges who want to uphold the rule of law now have their hands tied or don't know how the Supreme Court's ruling affects them. And so now they're suddenly on uncertain ground. I know the politics of this, you know, it's a conversation for another day. I think on some level, though, watching this whole thing, it's as dispiriting to me in terms of the future of the democratic experiment in America. It's as dispiriting as really anything that's happened over the course of these last 6 or 7 years.
Right, because it's forever. I mean, a Supreme Court decision is binding until a new Supreme Court decision reverses this decision. It's done.
Yeah, and we're going to have a conservative court for a very long time.
Yeah. There's smoke. There's usually fire. And the repeated denials of any connection between the radical manifesto written by the Heritage Foundation to send America back to the 1800s and Team Trump are generating a whole lot of smoke. Now for the fire, brand new reporting reveals that the very same people behind that radical manifesto, Project 2025, are also behind Trump's Republican Party and their official party platform. ABC News reports this, quote, in May, the Trump campaign and the RNC announced their platform committee leadership team, the senior officials tasked with drafting the Republican platform. And they named Russ Vought as the platform committee's policy director and Ed Martin as deputy policy director. Both have ties to Project 2025. And as we reported on this program yesterday, Vought was a former Trump administration staffer, which brings us to the wider point. If you want to look at what Trump and his allies plan to do in a second Trump term, look at what they sought to do in the first. A key plank of Project 2025 is a total transformation of the way the Justice Department has functioned since the very beginning. It calls for the undoing of the central tenet of the Department of Justice, its independence from politics. Project 2025 calls to, quote, ensure the assignment of sufficient political appointees throughout the Department of Justice. That means purge experienced career law enforcement officials, replace them with appointees who will do whatever Donald Trump asks. Experience, merit, ability to pass a background check, none of that will happen. None of that will matter. The only qualification for serving in Trump's DOJ, loyalty and acquiescence to Trump. And as Trump has repeated over and over and over again, a key priority for his second term will be, in his words, retribution and revenge. That means more people will have harrowing experiences like our next guest, Michael Cohen, had. Michael Cohen was sent back to prison, notably 4 years ago today, in a move a judge deemed retaliatory for refusing to back off publishing a book about Donald Trump. It's where we start the hour with the aforementioned Michael Cohen, host of the Mea Culpa and Political Beatdown podcast, author of the books Disloyal and Revenge, How Donald Trump Weaponized the U.S. Department of Justice Against His Critics. Michael Cohen, it's great to see you.
Good to see you, Nicole.
I feel like we are sort of sleepwalking into this false notion that what Trump promises in a second term is new. It's not. It's what he successfully did in a first term, which is to prosecute and jail people who threaten him, people he deems his rivals or opponents, people like you. Tell us what happened 4 years ago today.
People like you too, Nicole, and the president of your MSNBC station. Donald has been very clear about his enemies list. And there are many people on it, including folks like Mark Zuckerberg. What they did is they lured me down to 500 Pearl Street, and they provided me, and I showed this on your program a couple of weeks back. They presented myself and a friend of mine who's a lawyer, Jeffrey K. Levine, who I asked to join me because something just seemed terribly amiss. And they gave us this 2-page document that is filled with syntax and grammatical and spacing errors. And the very first paragraph is a complete and total violation of my First Amendment constitutional right, in that it prohibited me from speaking to the media, publishing a book, doing television, anything, including friends and family were supposed to be warned not to discuss anything to do with me because it would glamorize a federal inmate who is on confinement status. It was an absolute ridiculous paragraph, again, that was drafted for me. And how do we know this 2-page document was drafted for me? Because it does not contain a federal identifiable number to it, whereas the real one clearly does. Well, when I refused to sign it and asked that they tamp down the language because my book, Disloyal at the time, was already with the printer, what they did is instead they had a guy named Patrick McFarland, who's an RRM over at a residential reentry manager over at MDC Correctional Facility, sign a remand order, and they had me taken into custody by 3 marshals who handcuffed and shackled me. And I say this not in order to glamorize what happened to me, but really to send a message to the American people, something I've been yelling from the rooftops from every single platform that I can, that my biggest fear is that what they did to me, they will do to you. Donald already has a blueprint of what he needs to do, and that's weaponizing the Department of Justice, weaponizing government, which he said he was also going to do. Every person that works in government will be working not for the United States government, but for him. And they will be required to sign a loyalty pledge to him, meaning there will be no opportunity to file, as I did through my other lawyer, Danya Perry, a habeas corpus petition that had me released from the 16-day solitary confinement, bringing it to a total of 51 days of solitary confinement. Nobody will have that option again if Donald Trump ends up in the White House.
What impact, I mean, you know the inside of his brain in terms of his desire to stay just on the other side of criminality, to stay out of jail, to avoid what Chris Christie used to say, the clink of the door. The Supreme Court wiped away that check on his worst impulses by granting him absolute immunity. What do you think he's capable of?
Absolutely anything and everything. You allow your mind to wander into the farthest level of dystopia, and then you will finally get a small glimpse into just how far that he will push this. Look, I want to be clear about this. What he did to me is absurd. It made me the very first political prisoner held by my own country, by the United States of America, for refusing to waive my First Amendment constitutional right. The Supreme Court decision just gave him immunity from prosecution on this by claiming, and you'll have to do it on an ad hoc basis, by claiming that this was a presidential act, that it was done in furtherance of the office of presidency. There is no limit to what he and his sycophants that will be there in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue will be successful in at least attempting to do.
Michael, he's talked about a televised military tribunal for Liz Cheney. People laugh it off. What do you think when you hear that?
I tell you not to laugh. There is not, first of all, there's nothing funny about it. There's nothing funny about a man who is seeking the highest office in our land, who would, in essence, again, be the most powerful person on the planet. And he's talking about military tribunals. He's talking about public executions. He's talking about using SEAL Team 6 within which to go into round up his political enemies and opponents and in jail, incarcerate them the way that he wants them to do it. Now, in order to help to stop this sort of movement, tomorrow, in fact, in the morning, my lawyers are going to be filing a writ of certiorari to the Supreme Court of the United States in order to hear the case Michael Cohen versus United States of America. Because in that case, that's the habeas corpus petition that Judge Alvin K. Hellerstein deemed that the actions of Trump, the administration, Bill Barr, DOJ was retaliatory. I don't think people understand the term enough, and I don't think it gets enough play. Certainly not by this White House, that's the Biden White House. It was retaliatory by an evil and vindictive individual who will seek to do this again and again and again. And again, because of the Supreme Court decision, he will have unlimited authority and power. Whether it's true or not, he will feel that he does, and he will take advantage of every single avenue that he possibly can. And my statement that I say to everyone, including Joe Biden and his family, including Hunter Biden, including you, including Mark Zuckerberg, including Elon Musk, including members of the Supreme Court themselves, be warned. Be very warned.
John Hellman, I feel like we as a media are so slow to adapt to how quickly Trump moves the Overton window and what was the terrain of extraordinary investigative journalism during the first Trump term, which was figuring out what he was really trying to get Jeff Sessions and then Bill Barr and Rod Rosenstein to do, is now in the Republican Party platform, right? Politicizing DOJ and using it for political prosecutions and persecutions is now the RNC position on a website out loud. And it is part of normalizing it so that when it happens, there's this moment where people say, well, we knew this was going to happen, right? This isn't new. No, no, no. This is new. This is not normal. And this is absolutely what he plans to do.
Right. And, I think it's one of the liberating, I'm saying this ironically, but it's one of the liberating things about becoming a convicted felon is, once you're lawless, once you're officially in the realm of the lawless, you're kind of freed of all obligation to still be lawful, at least in your mind, if you're Donald Trump. And Nicole, people have forgotten that, Trump was so new. The things he was willing to do were so new, were so far outside the realm of any historic precedent in the presidency that it was a heroic thing that journalism did in that period when he was in office, because all of it was new. No one had really experience seeing anything quite like that before, and a lot of it was happening in the shadows. Right in 2020, and this is the part that people forget, there was no Republican platform in 2020. I mean, Donald Trump had a convention where they just said there will be no platform. Whatever Trump says is the party platform. It was the ultimate, le parti c'est moi. He was the platform. And that, again, made it difficult because, there was some effort there to hide the ball. Now there is no effort to hide the ball. It's all there, and it's all out in front of us. And so it boasts the responsibility of journalists and all citizens, frankly, to get their heads around what he's proposing. It makes it all that much higher, the responsibility. But in some sense, it makes it easier because he is really doing us the favor. And I say that somewhat ironically, but not totally. He's doing us the favor of basically saying, you want to call me a criminal? Fine. Hold my beer. Here's the new stuff I'm going to do that is how far I'm willing to go now that I'm kind of the Jesse James of Republican or national politics. We can see it. The only question is what we're going to do about it.
Well, and Justice Sotomayor writes, Harry Litman in her dissent, that, or I think it's Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, that warns of the White House becoming a seat of criminal conduct. The Supreme Court greenlit that. That's what they have ushered in. I mean, they don't live on an hermetically sealed island where they don't know who the actors are. The case was Donald Trump versus the United States of America. What should people be prepared for?
So they have greenlit it, and Trump didn't even need green lights before. He went through amber and red ones. John's is the stunning point. He's now trying to distance himself as Trump from the 972-page plan, and who knows, I doubt he's read even to page 2. But the big points of it, mainly the complete enemies list of anyone who's ever crossed him. And second, the absolute gutting of the civil servants, starting with DOJ, is just a manifest danger for what Michael Cohen said, but a whole long laundry list. And that is not even slightly hidden. And you're right. And I know we'll talk about this more, but the court has really greenlit it, or at least insulated it. And we are in some kind of serious situation here going into November.
Right, where the voters are truly the only people that can stop it if they don't like it.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.